So today we're fortunate enough to have Nichelle Cobb from University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the director of Smart IRB. She's going to be giving us a kind of an overview, general talk about single IRB, and then we're going to hear from two PIs, James Cnota from Cincinnati Children and Pooja Khatri from University of Cincinnati, giving us their perspective on working with single IRB, and then we'll finish it off with Mike Linke and Jeremy Corsmo sharing with us their kind of lessons learned and things they wish everyone knew about single IRB working with the IRB.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nichelle Cobb, and I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm also the director of Smart IRB Operations, as Mina mentioned, and I just want to give a thank you both to Mina and to Dr. Hybe for inviting me and making this happen. We had hoped to do this last April in person, so I'm missing out on all sorts of things Cincinnati, but I'm pleased to be here today. So what I want to talk about today is I often talk about the Smart IRB project, which was a federally funded project to support the implementation of single IRB review. And when I talk about it, I'm often concentrating on what the reviewing IRB's roles are and the relying institutions, because we spent a lot of time trying to help get this off the ground because of the requirements, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I really want to focus more on the effects and the roles of the study teams in regard to single IRB review, because what I'm finding as I talk to study teams is that the idea of single IRB review sounds great in concept, and I think there are some benefits to it, and I think we're getting better at it. But there are definitely some reckonings happening where there were some unexpected shifts of responsibility to study teams, and the idea of working with a whole bunch of different IRBs, each with its own quirks. And I say this as I was the director of the biomedical IRBs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 20 years. I understand that every IRB is different, so I want to be sensitive to that. So I'll talk a little bit about that and some resources that have been put together to assist research teams, and we're still working on some more. First, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'm going to just mention what I think are some of what the impact of single IRB is. And single IRB review means can mean different things to different people, but what I'm talking about in regard to single IRB is that it's the use of one IRB to review and approve all or most participating sites in a multi-site research study. So instead of everybody going to their own local IRB to get approval or different IRBs, the goal and the intent of the changes to the regulations that happened to support this was that the idea was one IRB, it would be much more efficient to do that. Other terms for single IRB that you may hear: central IRB. I think many of you know about StrokeNet, which is one of the famous central IRBs, but you'll also hear me use the term reviewing IRB, and that often means single IRB as well. So where does single IRB review come from? It's been around, and many of us know, aside from StrokeNet, which has been established in Cincinnati, the National Cancer Institute Central IRB, and several independent IRBs like Advar, Irbs, Copernicus. Those have existed for a long time, but what's different now is the scale and the kinds of studies that a lot of pharmaceutical research industry studies were being reviewed by independent IRBs, but now we're getting a lot more investigator-initiated studies going to and being required to use single IRB, and not just biomedical, but a lot of social behavioral too. So before 2018, there were certainly single IRBs, and it was used, especially the National Cancer Institute one or the VA, and StrokeNet was certainly established, the StrokeNet IRB before 2018, but it was really January 25th, 2018, where NIH set out its policy and said, you know, now we're going to require multi-site research supported by NIH to have single IRB review with some exceptions, and those exceptions are very rare. And they promise that you can ask for exceptions, but they're not very eager to grant exceptions. And then following the NIH rule in January 2020, that's a day that will live in infamy, that most multi-site research subject to the common rule, so that means federally supported research beyond NIH, was now subject to a single IRB review. So for a multi-site study that was doing the same protocol, you to identify one IRB to rule them all, essentially. We have been waiting a bit for the FDA to harmonize. So the FDA currently does not require single IRB review if it falls solely under FDA regulations, but certainly the FDA has supported and doesn't oppose the use of single IRB for multi-site research. So this is what the world kind of looked like in a very simplified form. Multi-site research before single IRB. This was a case that, as I mentioned, each study team was submitting their application to their local IRB. And so you had different IRBs for different sites. And then what you also had is that these local IRBs, and I'm going to make this point in just a moment, because this has become one of the biggest challenges, I think, for institutions is how the Human Research Protection Program kind of was blown up by single IRB. And I think that's something NIH didn't understand, and why there has been a lot of reorganization and rethinking as a result of single IRB on the behalf of both IRBs and institutions. So often the local IRBs would serve as the gatekeepers to ensure the institutional requirements that are required to activate a study are met. So you may have noticed in some of your IRB applications that there's a lot of questions of, do you have this approval? Do you have that approval? Are you doing this? And sometimes institutions actually have electronic systems set up so that it triggers all these ancillary reviews, such as conflict of interest, biosafety, radiation safety, and not in using a single IRB has had an effect on that. So just to make the point here is that now in the past, local IRBs handled this in different ways. That sometimes the local IRB would be the extreme gatekeeper and hold its approval until all institutional requirements met. And so when a study team had IRB approval, they knew that they were ready to go. Then you have cases where some IRBs would check for some of these requirements before issuing approval, but there would be other ones that study teams had to identify, figure out, and make sure they happen before study activation. And of course, you get cases where increasingly now we're seeing that institutions have IRB review, and then this other review, such as a clinical trials office or something like that, that is making sure these requirements are met that are needed in order for a study to be activated. And then lastly, we have the case where our dear research teams are just left on your own, like, okay, you've got IRB approval, but you need to know and figure out everything else that you have to have in place before you have a study activated. So that was before single IRB review. So after this implementation of both the NIH and then the common rule requirements, we have now one IRB to rule them all, as I said, and then this IRB is actually receiving information from each site about their local context, and that local context information can be various things, which I'll mention in a moment. And then once it gets the local context information, it then issues an IRB approval for each site under its purview. So you'll have site A, B, C, and D all getting approval from IRB-B. But one of the other things that remains, and this is why it's been challenging for institutions, is that the sites are still responsible for ensuring institutional requirements are completed before study activation. So sites vary on whether, as I said, they have additional assistance to study teams, whether they leave it up to study teams, or there's some combination of approaches of how to ensure these other things that are needed before study approval are in place, or study approval is activated, or studies activated. And an example I can think from my own institution, we use an independent IRB, and when study teams would go through the local IRB, there is a state law, and I think many states have this, that you're actually, if you are using radiation in your research for non-healing arts, you actually have to get a sign-off from a state agency. And so the local IRB monitored for this and wouldn't issue our approval until that had happened, just because it was kind of an obscure requirement. So we helped the study teams identify when they needed this, made sure it happened, facilitated the process, and then released the approval when that had been done. But then for study teams using an independent IRB, we found several instances where study teams were not getting that approval from the state. And they said, well, the IRB never told us we had to get that approval. And we said, well, and we talked to the independent IRB, and they said, we're not going to do that for you. That's not an IRB's responsibility. We said, yes, we know, but we don't really have another process at our institution to do this. So I think the research teams really appreciated that we were helping them as the local IRB figure these things out, and were a little surprised and had to make some adjustments after when they started using external IRBs. So this is kind of what I see has happened, is that you'll see that in many cases, and this is not true of all institutions, because some institutions were very good at separating IRB review from other reviews, but there's a lot of interplay between the local IRB and other human research protection program components. So often IRBs are feeding information to grants and contracts people and vice versa. Certainly there's often contact with the research pharmacy, even sometimes consultations about whether something needs an IND. There are other cases where conflict of interest, for example, is really important, that most academic institutions have it set up so that the conflict of interest determinations are often made by a committee external to the IRB, and that information flows to the IRB, and the IRB considers that as part of its deliberations about whether the management plan is sufficient. Is there anything in addition what needs to go in the consent form? So before single IRB, these offices and functions often were pretty well connected. They were not always perfectly connected, but there was, they were connected, and it was kind of the local IRB often was the linchpin. But after single IRB, that kind of disappeared. And so institutions were kind of left trying to figure out, okay, so how do we connect these offices again? In many cases, that connection actually was through, became the local IRB again, but was kind of the local IRB acting on behalf of the institution. But so this means that a lot of institutions had to develop new local processes. And often this is where a lot of CTSA programs stepped in, but I can think of a couple of places where they actually have an office that they set up specifically to help researchers navigate these non-IRB requirements. And in fact, in some places, you'll get an IRB approval notice. So it may be from an internal IRB or an external IRB, and then the research teams know they can't start the study until they get an activation letter from this other office, sometimes called a clinical trials office or clinical trials assistance office. So I'm increasingly seeing some of those set up, because one of the things we definitely don't want to happen with single IRB is for researchers to feel lost and have it even more difficult on them to get research off the ground. So a lot of institutions are really thinking about how can we better support our research teams in the kind of reconfiguration of our human research protection programs. So the title of my talk is Single IRB is a Team Sport, and I think that is absolutely true, and I think Mike will talk a bit about this later too. But when I think about single IRB, I think about the players on the team are being the reviewing IRBs, the relying institutions, the lead study team, and I'll say a bit more about the lead study team, and then relying site study teams. And when I talk about these different components, I will admit that I'm generally talking about investigator-initiated research, but this certainly can happen with pharmaceutical research as well. But it's often with investigator-initiated research that you see that these roles become different, because you don't have resources from a central pharmaceutical sponsor that can help you manage your study. So these responsibilities kind of fall in a different way. So the key to success for single IRB to really work, and this is true of anything, is really for the different players to know their roles and the responsibilities as part of the team. So if they communicate well and work together, it can actually be a pretty smooth process and very successful. And I think with StrokeNet, there was a lot of work put into making these roles clear and providing a lot of good support and communication, so that the single IRB process became quite robust. And sometimes it's often called the Cadillac, or I like to say the Tesla, of single IRB review processes. So as I said, I really want to focus on the study team roles. And to me, what we usually see with research, especially if it's investigator initiated, is that you're going to have an overall principal investigator, and that overall principal investigator will have specific responsibilities. And one of them, and this is increasingly what an expectation is amongst a lot of the academic IRBs, and I will just to be clear that this is very different when you're working with independent IRBs, these commercial IRBs versus academic IRBs. So in terms of key study roles, there's the overall principal investigator. There is an expectation amongst a vast majority of academic IRBs is that they're going to identify a lead study team. And this lead study team is going to have a key administrative function and provide communication support for the study. So in certain cases like StrokeNet, it will be a formalized coordinating center. In other cases for smaller studies or other arrangements, it may likely be that this is going to be members of the overall PI's own study team that will perform these functions, or sometimes, and I've seen a few CTSAs do this, that the CTSAs actually have some network support functions and actually can help provide people with the knowledge and expertise to do this kind of administrative and communication support for multi-site research, and they're just not designated formally as a coordinating center. So in addition to the overall PI and the lead study team, we of course have the site investigators, and they're going to be responsible for the conduct of the research at their institution. And then these Reliance site study teams for each of these sites, they are going to be the study team that has to really carry out the research at that site. But they certainly have some communication and coordination responsibilities as well. And so you'll hear me saying relying site study teams, and the reason why I use that term, because we use it in the Smart IRB project, but it is talking about any study team that is from a site that's relying on the central IRB or the single IRB. So that's where the relying site, because we talk about relying institutions, and then so it's a relying site study team. So the reason why the lead study team is important is that this is now a very common communication model amongst the academic IRBs. And so that what you see here is that the reviewing IRB will provide information and contact, and there will be back and forth between the reviewing IRB and the lead study team or the coordinating center. And the reviewing IRB will get information from the relying institutions, IRB or HRPP folks, and those will be like Reliance points of contact. And so what you can see is that there is no line between the reviewing communication lines between the reviewing IRB and the relying site study team. And this is what is frequently happening is the lead study team is coordinating this investigator communication with the reviewing IRB because the reviewing IRBs want one team to communicate with it about single IRB review. And so they, if they have to work with multiple study teams, it just gets very difficult. They often don't have the resources to do that. Plus, they want to be really clear that the lead study team should be in the know, and certainly that means the overall PI should be in the know. So when the lead study team is named, these are some of the things that the lead study team takes on. And so this is something that I've been talking with study teams about is like when you're writing grants, when you're putting together a protocol, when you're thinking about budgets, think about what resources you have in or will need if you don't have them to actually support the single IRB review if you are assuming like the lead study team responsibilities. Because a lot of the lead study teams, to make this process go smoothly, and I've seen this get better, the ones that are really good at it actually reach out to the relying site study teams and kind of explain to them the reviewing IRB processes, requirements, and policies. So each IRB has different policies for when you report unanticipated problems, non-compliance, what you report and when you report it. So that's a key thing that the lead study team would need to know and make sure that the relying institutions and relying sites study teams would know what to report, because the lead study team is going to be the one that will be reporting this to the reviewing IRB, because the lead study team then kind of often assumes this regulatory role for all of the sites. And so the lead study team will have to figure out how to collect information about those different sites if there are variations to be able to provide that to the reviewing IRB. And the reason for this is often that, again, the reviewing IRBs often do not have protocol intake and review systems that will work very well with if you have a bunch of different sites using them. They don't necessarily want to educate all those sites. And often the reviewing IRB is at the institution of the overall PI. And so the lead study team then often knows that system and can actually communicate and help the other teams navigate. So it's really a matter of coordinating and organizing the communication. But you can imagine that is an additional role that often study teams each did for themselves when there wasn't single IRB review. Everybody was submitting, as I showed before, to their local IRB, so they knew those processes, they knew the expectations of their local IRB. Now all these study teams are working with an external IRB, and they may not be that familiar with that, and they may be working with one external IRB, but if they have multiple studies, I can think that they're going to get study teams that are working with 5, 6, 7 more external IRBs, because there's not necessarily, unlike StrokeNet, there isn't necessarily a consistent single IRB that will be the IRB of record for a study. The other thing that the lead study team is often responsible for is getting that information from the IRB, the approval notices, the stamped consent forms, the approved version of the protocol, and getting them back to the Reliance Site study team. So, you know, when you're a study team working with your local IRB, if you have an electronic system, you're logging in and you're getting your documents, and that's often not the way that it works with single IRB, so that the lead study team has to have a way of getting those documents from the reviewing IRB and making sure they're disseminated and received by the Reliance Site study teams, and not just for initial review, but for after initial review, for changes of protocol, continuing review, for reportable events. The other thing that is key to this is the consent form, and that actually has been one of the most complex issues for reviewing IRBs in the single IRB situation, is handling a variety of consent forms for each site. So more reviewing IRBs are getting very strict on what parts of the consent form can or cannot be updated, and trying to manage that local institutional or institutionally required language for each of the institutions using the reviewing IRB. And the last responsibility I mentioned, and just showing you on the slide, is this distribution. And so I've known that some study teams have looked into different ways of storing and sharing that, like using Dropbox and Box, or there are a few programs that are available where you can actually share documents, like the IRB Reliance Exchange. So just like the lead study teams has responsibilities, the key ones for the site PIs and the relying site study teams are making sure that they follow the policies and procedures of the reviewing IRB. So they do need to know what those policies and procedures are, at least certain ones of them, like reportable events and when you need to submit personnel updates for a variety of IRBs. And I talked to study teams who have a tracking spreadsheets and other ways of saying, okay, for this IRB, we report these events within this time frame. For that IRB, we don't have to report this, but we have to report these, and this is the time frame. So that's one thing that the Smart IRB project, we're hoping to work on these things, and we are trying to work on these things to really help study teams, so that it would be nice if study teams knew that for any IRB I'm working with, I have to report these events, and this is the time frame. It doesn't matter which IRB I'm working with, but we're not there yet. The other things that site PIs and relying site study teams is really, it's incumbent on them to really make sure that they're providing information to the lead study team that may need to be reported to the reviewing IRB. So there will be information provided if there's continuing review for the study. There may be local events that happen that qualify as reportable events that need to be reported to the reviewing IRB. And I've seen this sometimes, that some study teams kind of forget who their IRB is and kind of forget that they still have this role in providing this communication. So I've seen more and more lead study teams kind of prompting on a regular basis, any new updates to personnel, any events that happen. So they're organizing and reminding in a different way than they were before single IRB. And many of these things that they're doing are just best practices for lead study teams, coordinating a multi-site study. But I think this really, single IRB kind of emphasized and made necessary some of these things to be in place. Again, you know, just working with the reviewing IRB on providing any local language they need in the consent form. And then the other thing is that study teams still may need to report things to their local institutions. So some institutions require copies of all the documents that the reviewing IRB approves. Some want an annual check-in. Some want to see certain amendments and sign off on those amendments before they go to the reviewing IRB. So this is something new too, that the study teams are trying to navigate, both what are my local requirements if an external IRB is reviewing my study, what do I need to tell locally and who do I need to tell, as well as what I do need to make sure goes to the reviewing IRB. So that's a complexity that I think is the biggest challenge for the Relying Site Study Team. But I have to say, in the scheme of things, if I had a choice, I would want to be the Relying Site Study Team and let a really good lead study team take care of all these things. I would be very happy to just provide that information, because many of them don't have to do those regulatory requirements anymore, preparing an IRB application and shepherding it through the IRB review process. So as you can imagine from some of these things that I've been saying, one of the things I strongly advocate, and I think this is really caught on for the most part, is that you need to have communication points of contact for each of these members of the team. So reviewing IRBs, I think they are increasingly having people who are designated to handle and communicate with relying sites and provide them with information. And I was thinking about the time that my institution was relying on the StrokeNet IRB, and I remember Linke calling me and saying, Nichelle, we have a report for your institution. I wanted to talk through with you what it was and how we're going to handle it. And to me, that was A+ service of having somebody reach out to me, and it really gave me confidence in the IRB, aside from knowing that Mike is involved. But it was something that I really appreciated, that the reviewing IRB had processes in place to actually reach out to institutions that would be affected. And again, the relying institutions need to have a point of contact, so that if Mike needed to know who to call about this reliance arrangement, and so increasingly institutions, and certainly if they're part of the Smart IRB agreement, any relying institution has to have a point of contact assigned who can guide research teams and work with the reviewing IRB on reliance arrangements. But having said that, it's really important for lead study teams to have somebody who knows that I'm the person or the group that's going to make sure this information gets out to the relying site study teams, and that I'm getting information from those teams in an appropriate time frame, so we can promptly report that to the reviewing IRB, anything that needs to go to the reviewing IRB. And by the same token, Reliance Site Study Team should have somebody who is the point of contact, thinking about what they're going to provide to the lead study team, what they need to provide locally, but is that person who can answer questions about how things are done at their institution and how that institution is implementing a study. Without these kinds of clear points of contact, it is really can make things a mess. And I'll talk later on about the communication plan and a template that Smart IRB developed that I think a lot of IRBs have adopted and work with study teams to complete, to make it clear and document who is going to be the key communication person for various things, various components and types of communication related to a study. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the reliance process. And the reliance process really can happen in various ways, but this is generally how we see things shape up. And one thing I'm not going to talk about, which is really important, is what study teams should do when they have a NIH grant, for example, and they're going to submit that. And as part of that now, for multi-site human subjects research, especially clinical trials, you have to have a single IRB plan as part of your NIH grant. But in general, the reliance process has to take, what I mean by that is that for one institution to use a single IRB for multi-site research, you actually have to have a formal agreement to document that arrangement. And these arrangements are between institutions rather than between researchers and an IRB. So we have had some researchers misunderstand that, I can just say I'm going to use this other IRB. It's actually, unless they are totally independent of an institution, their institution has to be involved in this agreement. So these agreements for single IRB are called Reliance Agreements. And the Smart IRB, the project I work with, one of the cornerstones of Smart IRB is this thing called the Master Reliance Agreement. Also, we just call it the Smart IRB Agreement. And we now have almost 800 institutions that have signed on to this agreement. And the reason why this agreement was developed is, for a long time, when you would reach out, and my institution worked on reliance issues about 10 years ago, when we'd reach out to other institutions and say, hey, we would like to seed review to you all, or can we serve as the single IRB for this? Other institutions say, if they responded, they would say, oh, I don't know how we do that. I don't think we do that. So getting an agreement in place was kind of difficult, but now that it's required, the Smart IRB agreement actually is something that institutions can actually invoke and say, we're going to use this to cover a reliance arrangement. So if you are one of the almost 800 institutions, which the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati Children's Hospital both are, you can actually, eliminate a step, because it often took a lot of time for each legal counsel at an institution to look at the agreement and make feedback. So we've eliminated that with the Smart IRB agreement. So then now all institutions do is say, okay, we have a study in common together. We're going to use Single IRB. University of Cincinnati will be the reviewing IRB. University of Wisconsin-Madison will be the relying site. We'll use this for Dr. Lynch's study. We are going to use the Smart IRB agreement and we'll document that. So that has made things go so much easier for researchers too, where I've seen researchers now peruse the Smart IRB has this list of participating institutions, say, okay, we can use these institutions, they already have a reliance and agreement that can be used between each other. So it was kind of a treaty agreement that what institutions signed was, we are agreeing to the terms of the Smart IRB agreement, and we can agree to those terms with whoever else has signed on. So how and reliance arrangements get started, as you can imagine, it's usually the research team. Sometimes it comes in a different way, but the research team will say, oh, I have the study, I have a grant, or I actually have the study that I need to get started, and I know I need to use Single IRB review. So then the study team needs to really contact the potential reviewing IRB to say, can you do this? Sometimes that's the home institution's IRB, the IRB at the overall PI's institution, but sometimes it's going to be somebody else's institution. So like the Trial Innovation Network, there are 3 IRBs that are available if you apply to use those IRBs, and often they're IRBs at academic institutions that aren't involved in the research. So you kind of need to start getting your ducks in a row and say, if we ask you to do this, can you do this, and will you be willing to do this? And then if the reviewing IRB is not the overall PI's institution's internal IRB, then you at the same time probably need to start talking to that office that's involved in reliance arrangements, and it's usually an IRB office, and say, we'd like to use this IRB for the study. Are you okay with that? Because they do have the say-so in who's going to be used for the reviewing IRB. And then each institution that I've seen, and I know this occurs for at your institutions, that the overall PI or the lead study team is going to submit a formal request to the home institution for reliance arrangements. So each institution is really going to collect some information, because institutions are still responsible, even if they're using an external IRB, for ensuring that the research teams comply with the reviewing IRB's determinations and the regulations more generally. So most institutions need some way of tracking the studies that still fall under their purview, even if they're using external IRB. And that's why you fill out some local form to make a request for a reliance arrangement, and also to allow them to say, okay, we know that we have this study and so is going to be the reviewing IRBs. So that if you ever get an auditor, you're going to be able to give them a list of, here are the ones that we are keeping tabs on. So once this need for a reliance arrangement is recognized, then this is where the Smart IRB agreement can be really helpful. But this also is another place where the lead study team really can provide some guidance to these all the participating sites about, okay, all our participating sites, you need to let them know who the reviewing IRB is, have them contact their local IRB or Human Research Protection Program office and say, we're going to need a reliance arrangement. Here's the deal. Here's who's going to be the reviewing IRB. Hopefully you're okay with that. And then we need you to execute a reliance arrangement. And then the reviewing IRB and relying institutions will execute that arrangement. And once that arrangement is in place, there's going to be the next step of actually beginning to collect information for initial review. So when the reviewing IRB says they'll take on this role, they have to have information, as I said before, about each of the institutions, about what state laws might vary and other things. I'll talk about what local context is more, but the relying institution points of contact, which may be in their local IRB, the IRB office, are the ones that are going to provide that information, and they may need to reach out to the study team to get some more details. But the relying institutions are going to provide this local context information to the reviewing IRB, and the lead study team will have to also figure out also, are there any variations in how this study is going to be implemented or executed at each site, because we'll need to tell the IRB about those variations. So there can often be variations in recruitment approaches, study subject identification, or and certainly informed consent language. And then once IRB approval is initiated, as I mentioned before, the lead study team is going to then give that information back to the relying site study teams. So local context information that study teams or institutions and study teams are often working to provide either to the reviewing IRB or the lead study team are things like, are certain ancillary reviews that could affect IRB review done? Are there differences in resources, such as how much radiation the MR that a device emits, is that different across sites? Are you going to have different populations across sites? But even drug and device storage or HIPAA privacy rules. So state laws can vary, especially if it's across states. So those are things that the reviewing IRB has to collect in order to do its job. And then after initial review, there are things that still happen. So this is where, as I talked about before, the relying site study team is going to be telling the reviewing IRB about ongoing events that could affect that research study. It can also, if you have changes in personnel and certainly changes in conflicts of interest for those personnel, that needs to get to the reviewing IRB. These things change after the study. And then these are things that the relying institutions, as I said, may be asking study teams to provide information locally because they still have to oversee the study as well. So in general, my sense is that Single IRB has shifted responsibilities for academic IRBs. So that IRBs academic IRBs especially will vary in whether they will serve as a reviewing IRB, and if they will serve as a reviewing IRB, how big of a study they will, because it takes a lot of resources to collect that local context information and do that communication with the various study teams. And for relying institutions, as I showed before, this monitoring for compliance with institutional requirements and federal regulations has become a different kind of process. And so often there are different routes that are taken that study teams may have been familiar with one way of doing things that will change for study teams. As I think I illustrated, I think there's a lot of responsibility that overall PIs and lead study teams take on if one has to be identified for a study, especially with that communication, both gathering information and disseminating information back. And then, as I said before, I think that there's a bit of a decrease in regulatory responsibility for relying site study teams, eliminating that regulatory preparation, but still relying site study teams have to make sure that they are providing and communicating the information to the lead study team as well as their local institution. So before we turn it over to the other panelists, I just want to mention, because I don't like to mention challenges without saying, well, here are some things that can help you. So as I mentioned, Smart IRB is a federally supported project, and it's supported by NIH and specifically NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. And one of the big parts of Smart IRB, aside from the agreement, is education and training. And so one of the things we launched this year is several startup packages, and one of them is directed at study teams. And what the startup package is it's kind of a group of documents that we have on our resources page, but we put them together and organize them so that when you download it, it comes to you in a folder, and then there is a spreadsheet like you can see here that actually says what the resource is, when you would use it, and why you would use it. And so it also includes some training materials referenced in this package. But one of the ones that I think is very helpful, and I've seen several study teams use this, is that there's a template description for grant applications about language that you can adapt when you're describing the single IRB process, especially if you're using the Smart IRB agreement, which NIH likes to see. The other big thing is this communication plan, and it's a template that can be downloaded and adapted. So I've seen many institutions put their own logo on it and their own spin on it. But the idea of this Smart IRB communication plan is that it identifies and documents who is going to communicate what, who's going to submit the initial review application, who's going to submit the conflict of interest management plans to the reviewing IRB, who is distributing the IRB approved documents. So it's nice to have this also. It helps study teams plan. Here are the things that we know we're going to be responsible for, but it also helps if it's actually filled out and documented and agreed upon by all the parties, so that if there's ever a question, you can pull out the documentation and say, here, this is who needs to report this, or yeah, we should have reported, so-and-so should have reported that. So that, I think, is a document that is, I've seen used by many institutions now. The other thing that I'll mention is the online Reliance system that Smart IRB has. And many institutions use this, not all of them, but it's free. You sign up for it. And what it does is it allows study teams to actually put requests through the system for Reliance arrangements. And if the institutions are part of Smart IRB, you can identify who you want to be the reviewing IRB, who are going to be the participating sites. And this system actually routes all of that request through, and each institution can sign off. So it actually can track where a Reliance request is. It can track when it is approved, and it tracks multiple requests. So it's been a really nice system that Harvard Catalyst put together and is to support the research community. The last thing I'll mention is that we also have these short training modules for research teams, and they're PowerPoints with voiceover that are available on demand. And they have things like, how do you select a single IRB? What are the roles? So I will leave it there and turn it back to Mina, and we'll talk more in questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nichelle. And thank you for to our CCTST for supporting this event. I need to click this stop share here, and we should be able to go back. All right. So hang on just a second. I've got about 2 clicks to do, and then we will be ready to keep going. So our next, we're going to move on to our PI perspective. So I will have 2 PIs, one and then the other, sharing some information with us on their experience with single IRB. And Pooja, you've got the floor. If you don't mind starting with just a brief introduction of who you are, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good. It's great to follow up Nichelle's introduction and overview because I think that was one of the clearest presentations I've heard about how all of this works, and it's been a learning curve over the last 15 years. I'm a professor of neurology here at UC, and I've been working in clinical trials since I've been here, direct the UC stroke team, and then I co-direct the National Coordinating Center for NIH StrokeNet, which basically facilitates all multi-center stroke trials that are funded by NIH. So, you know, given that beautiful overview from Nichelle, I would say that maybe what I can do is just share some anecdotes of sort of how this all came together in my own experience as a PI and as a member of StrokeNet, and say that, you know, when I started out doing trials, learning to do trials back 15 years ago, we were doing an international trial run out of Cincinnati. And there was central IRB was not a thing. It was not easily accepted. I mean, there was actually, I think in theory, Western IRB, but people weren't ready to sign on to that. And it was a lot of work in terms of on the ground, working with each site, with each coordinator who had varying levels of knowledge about how to navigate IRBs, how to dealing with local issues regarding what should be in the consent, having a different consent for each place, doing a separate amendment in each place for that entire consent or protocol. So this is a real game changer in the field. And I remember back when one of our colleagues who ran clinical research, Dr. Kaufman, Petra Kaufman, brought up that we were going to do this and this was really going to happen at NIH, and it frankly seemed inconceivable. So it's really cool to be here on this other side now and see this in action. And I have to say, it really truly is the way to go from my perspective. You know, I think one of the things that was challenging, and I'm sure Dr. Link can speak to this much better than I can, is getting other IRBs to get comfortable relying on a particular reviewing IRB. And frankly, what I think really helped was when the NeuroNext network, I think that may have been the first NIH network, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that required a central IRB, but having that requirement and then having leading institutions say, I want to be in this club, and if I'm going to be in this club, I have to rely on a central single IRB. I got things going and started to create those learning curves. And that started, gosh, I think I want to say around 2012, and then, or 2011 maybe, or 10, around there. And by the time StrokeNet came along and we were getting ready, applying to be the National Coordinating Center, having the central IRB here at UC, those wheels had been greased at a subset of centers, but there was still, again, a long way to go. And at this point now, we have 11 ongoing trials in NIH StrokeNet, and many of these have well over 100 sites that are relying on us for that particular protocol here at UC. And our National Coordinating Center is playing that role that Nichelle talked about of the lead study team, streamlining those communications and trying to move things forward. I can't imagine us being able to do the scale of work we do now without a centralized process. I was asked to comment on any aha moments, and for me, the big one, and I think we all have the benefit of the doubt of hearing such a streamlined thought process, but realizing just you can't get rid of the local context form. That is still, the local context still has to be part of the process. So you might think, well, why, you know, does that really save that much time if at the end of the day I still have to talk to each local IRB? It actually does, because the bar is sort of set and a lot of the kinks have been worked out, and it's dotting the I's, crossing the T's, conflict of interest, delegation logs, things like that. Every once in a while there's a big question, but mostly there's sort of an efficiency again that comes down to it. And then I guess I would just add finally, which probably the biggest game changer now is the Smart IRB, because we really have these streamlined ways to not, you know, reinvent the wheel, even with the Reliance Agreements, to have master Reliance Agreements, have clear responsibilities laid out, have teaching videos like Nichelle just described. So I think it's a really exciting time for large scale clinical trials. And I'll stop there.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Cnota. I'm a pediatric cardiologist here at Cincinnati Children's. And I was invited because I'm the site PI for us within the Pediatric Heart Network, which is a multi-center clinical trial network sponsored by National Heart, Lung, and Blood. So our story is a little different, but we also have a bit of a central role here in Cincinnati. The PHN is now on its 4th cycle. So it's been around for a while and did the traditional single institution IRB process for all of the clinical trials up until about 5 years ago, when, you know, seeing the tea leaves coming for the common rule and the requirements for multi-center study, our network thought we could maybe, we're sort of a smaller group. It's a tight group. We work well together. We thought it's pretty nimble. So we thought, you know, and NIH was interested in whether we could learn something in trying to initiate that ourselves. And given that we looked at a few different models, including some of the commercial IRBs, that wasn't going to work for some of our institutions. And so ultimately we, as a network, started to look to see which of the participating institutions could serve that role. And given the experience we had in Cincinnati and some of the early work that had already been done, we sort of checked with Jeremy, and then we offered the network to see if we could take that role on for a first study. Interestingly, that first study was actually a public-private partnership with a pharma company. And so the the pharmaceutical company agreed to support the activity, which is key. You know, we don't want to overemphasize the fact that you need the resources, but you do need the resources because it is a lot of work to do the communication part that has been outlined so nicely. And so if you're a coordinating center, you can put that into your coordinating center grant, and you need to. If you're putting in your multi-center R01, now that's required within your grant application, but it takes a lot of work. I think now everybody realizes that. Probably at the time it was on the early part of the understanding for that, and now we realize it, how much work it is. The good news is that the sponsor recognizes the value, because what we've done over the last few years is taken on now a number of different studies. Once we got through our first experience, they came back and basically asked if we would do that for the rest of the network studies. So as new studies have come on, we now have a dedicated effort that is through the Data Coordinating Center at the new Health Corps New England Research Institute. And that was a responsibility they couldn't take on themselves, as opposed to an academic coordinating center. So we've been working with them, and the partnership's been pretty good. I think some of the lessons that have been learned, and I did talk to, I would say, our two leads, Kathleen Rathke and Michelle Hamster, on this to kind of get their intake on what are some of the messages, not only that I want to communicate as the PI, but from what the team, the lead team, which is effectively what we function as for the network. You know, I would say, besides getting structure and resources in place which allow it, things like getting involved early in the protocol, and particularly with the consent forms, save a lot of pain and suffering on the back end. And so the recognition of that within the network, I think, has meant that each subsequent effort has gradually become easier and easier. I know from my viewpoint, what I see is that having consistency in the face of our side of this, in the face of our program, and consistent relationships with each of the individual point people across all the institutions, but then across serial studies of different types, has facilitated the work quite a bit and make things more efficient. And so, you know, at this point, I think it's a pretty efficient machine. I think the sponsor recognizes that. And those are sort of the key experiences for us in this. Yep.
All right, so now we're going to hear from our two IRB representatives. So we'll start with Mike Linke at University of Cincinnati, and then we'll hear from Jeremy Corsmo, and then we'll go into questions thereafter.
Thanks, Mina. Hi, this is Mike. I am the chair of the University of Cincinnati IRB, and I think, as now most of you know, University of Cincinnati IRB also functions as a central IRB for NIH StrokeNet. So I've worked closely with Pooja over the last few years, and then Nichelle and I have really gotten to know each other through her work with Smart IRB, and just the kind of relationships that have been built, and Jeremy's been involved in this too. The increased use of single IRBs has really expanded our networks in terms of outreach to other universities. So really, I've been asked to kind of talk about some things that may improve researchers and interactions with single IRBs, central IRBs outside of your own institution. And after listening to Nichelle's presentation, really I'm going to just to highlight a few things that she said. I think that, you know, there are these areas that we've identified now over the years of doing this, of things that really could come up over and over again when we're dealing with sites. And I would like to say it's getting better, because, and Pooja said this too, that, you know, we're getting used to this and people are getting more used to it. it, and we're understanding better how to interact with IRBs that are outside of your institution. So, you know, one of the big things is understanding your local reliance process. Just because you're reviewing, you're going to rely on an outside IRB doesn't mean your local institution is not involved in these protocols anymore. And the one thing the increased use of single IRBs has done is really stress the importance of this. A lot of institutions now call it the Human Research Protection Program or something along those lines. So there's so much more than just IRB review, and Nichelle talked about that with the various types of ancillary reviews that are also required in order to have human subjects research approved. So the investigators really need to understand their own process and what's involved. You know, you just don't call up the central IRB or Advara and say, I want you to review my study. And most people know that, but we still occasionally come across situations where that happens at UC. So understanding your own process, knowing who to talk to in your own HRPP about the Reliance process. And then the flip side of that is understanding the single IRB review process, and the Smart IRB harmonization project is trying to streamline and align the different single IRB review processes. But as we all know, they're not the same. Nichelle pointed that out. And so each single IRB will do things probably a little differently. And so understanding what that is really helps so that you know what that IRB wants to see. So understanding both of those is important. And then local context always comes up when we're talking about using an outside IRB, and you want to really be able to communicate those to the single IRB so they understand your situation and what needs to be done special for your protocols, and explaining that and providing SOPs, or actually, you know, there are state rules and laws that sometimes apply, and providing those really helps, and not just saying it's because it's the way we do it. You know, the single IRBs really need to understand why you're asking for these changes. So that's really important. And you know, some things are as straightforward as, you know, the requirements for HIPAA authorization language. You know, at UC Health mandates that, and our investigators have to use that language. So making sure they understand where that's coming from, whether or not HIPAA can be in the consent form or has to be a standalone document. Those types of things, communicating those types of things help. One of the big issues we've come across with, at least early in the StrokeNet Central IRB process, is understanding the organizational structures of research sites. You know, you're worried about FWA, federal-wide assurance coverage for various sites, and investigators are very familiar with their own institutions and their own organizations. But if you're using an outside IRB and someone at UC says they're going to use the Schubert Clinic, well, that outside IRB isn't going to know that the Schubert Clinic is at Cincinnati Children's, and it's basically a contract research clinic, and you know how that interacts. So you really need to be able to explain that to them. Simple things like University of Cincinnati Medical Center. You know, usually the Reliance Agreement will be with the University of Cincinnati. UCMC is different. UC Health is different. And so being able to explain those structures to central IRBs really helps, because one of the things, at least for federally funded studies, is we have to make sure that there's proper federal-wide assurance coverage for the research sites. And then this came up over and over again. Pooja brought it up, and James brought it up too, and Nichelle. You know, good communications. You want to be able to have a point of contact at these at the IRB you're using. Develop relationships with them. Get on the phone. You know, networking. I always used to say, talk to these people at meetings and things. However, none of us are really going to meetings anymore. So, but even on these types of webinars, getting people's contact information and reaching out to them, and you know, if an email isn't going to work, really call somebody. That makes such a difference. I think is at least being able to explain the situation, and so that you understand what's going on and how you can try to make it better. So really identifying people that you can talk to within those IRBs or HRPPs can really help. So I think those are some of the things we've learned from StrokeNet. You know, StrokeNet is a different beast of most single IRBs because of the size and resources and support we get from the grant. But some of these will also apply, most of these ideas will also apply to smaller central IRB relationships in terms of being able to understand the processes. So I think those things are some of the things that can help you work with outside IRBs. Jeremy's.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm only going to say two things and I'm going to shut up, and so we can get to questions and discussion with folks. The only two things that I would highlight or reiterate to is one, I think it was talked about by both our PIs as well as Nichelle, but I would really want to highlight to everybody the important critical role for that single point of contact person or that person that is functioning at the lead side or the coordinating center, however that's situated for the project. If there is a single point of failure associated with making these single IRB projects work, it usually hinges on that role. That role is vital. And I would say the skill set that we've seen in my experience to look for in those kinds of people is not necessarily somebody that's just a great research coordinator, because much of the work that's involved here is kind of project management-y kind of work. It is a good communicator. It is an educator. It is really a challenge, not an easy position and not an easy role to fill, but someone that is in that role and is good at it. If any of you guys that are in that role and think that you do a really good job at it, ask for more money. I'm joking, but no, I mean, you are really critical to the success of making most of these single IRB projects, particularly if it's a network or those kinds of things work. And so that's vital. And then the only other thing that I would highlight again, and Mike touched on this as well, is the ongoing role of the relying institutions, IRB or HRPP or whatever the hell you want to call it, in the ongoing oversight of that project, unrelated to IRB review. And in my experience, we've particularly had some challenges with this when there is some kind of non-compliance that has happened at the relying site, or some kind of issue that they've had where the IRB is having to look at that. And me as a reviewing IRB, I don't want to come up with some kind of corrective and preventative action for some non-compliance that's happened at a relying site that makes absolutely no sense within that relying site's context, right? Not every hospital, not every university is situated the same way. And so if you are in a relying capacity, being able to be open and willing and prepared to engage with that reviewing IRB when it comes to what's the best way to deal with some non-compliance that's happened. I particularly run into challenges with this when there's non-compliance that's associated with protected health information and HIPAA, and needing to engage potentially the privacy office in legal or wherever that's situated at the relying institution. Getting those folks to engage can be really hard when it's something that's outside their normal flow of stuff. And so, and I think that's important when we're working with, when you're in a relying institution context, is knowing that once you make the decision to rely, you're not kind of out. And so that's it. I'll shut up. I'm supposed to advance the slide. Let me see if I can do it. Questions. So we're going to move on to questions, and I think I'm supposed to try to open the microphones here if they're not already open. No idea what's going to happen when I do this. Screen share has stopped. Okay, good. Screen share stopped. And now I need to unmute people. Are we fighting with each other? Are you driving?
Yeah, we're driving.
All right, you drive.
Well, I think we're done driving.
Okay.
So now we can open it up for questions.
So now I'm going to try to unmute people. Is this one of these options here?
Well, I mean, not by you.
How do I unmute everybody?
In the meantime, I have a question.
Good.
I'll fill the void. I'm wondering from any of the presenters, if you were to comment on
Fantastic.
what are the advantages to relying on a single IRB for sites who are apprehensive about doing so? Let's say I have a collective of 10 to 15 sites and 2 of them are a little apprehensive because of the capacity of their own IRB or just maybe apprehensive about change in general. What would be your biggest selling points to kind of using this sort of structure?
So that's a great question. I don't know if I don't know who wants to take that. Who wants to go first?
I can go first, but I'd love to hear what Pooja has to say too.
Yeah.
But we get this question a lot, and I think it's a fair question. But I think the one of the things, and Mike was talking about, is getting better. I think that sometimes it's kind of, it can be a lot of work the first time you do it. But the payoff often is like after. So for relying institutions, it makes it much easier with amendments and continuing reviews. And once you have your processes set up, many study teams and many sites that set it up start getting really good at it. It's that apprehension at first. And if you have somebody who is experienced and can mentor that site, that makes it much better experience too. But and there's definitely peer pressure going on that I've seen, is that, you know, at some points institutions are just not going to be able to avoid it. But I think that as we've learned, that as things get smoother, that will make it easier on these other sites that are apprehensive as they see some wins. And I think there have been some wins. So Pooja, do you want to add to that? Oh.
Unmute yourself, Pooja.
You were saying, I apologize, I missed that. Was it apprehension from the sites that are doing the referring, or apprehension to be the single IRB?
The former.
Sites that are referring, yeah. And I would say that that we've definitely seen that, and like Nichelle said, peer pressure helps a lot, and the success stories, and I guess the bottom line is this is just the wave of the future, and I just think we have to kind of work together. The mentoring idea is a great one, touching base with, you know, other institutions, particularly ones where there's a relationship and mutual respect, to just kind of see that this is totally doable, and that they're actually going to benefit from this, if, you know, with a good approach. I don't know, Mike, I know you've had to deal with the pushback more directly than I have.
I think one thing that helps when your IRB is reluctant to rely on another IRB is to have them reach out to that other IRB and talk to the IRB chair or the HRPP director. And people, you know, IRBs are, every IRB thinks they're the best IRB in the world, but there are other IRBs out there that can do a good job. You know, there's the whole accreditation process now. So, you know, if an institution is AHARP accredited, that gives people a little bit, makes people a little bit better about relying on them. But really, I think if you have your IRB that's reluctant, is to have them reach out to the IRB that's going to be the reviewing IRB and talk to them about it, and understand that it is still a partnership. You know, we get comments from sites from that IRBs that have questions or even requesting changes, and occasionally they identify good points that we may have missed. So, you know, it is still a relationship. So
I like you said, occasionally, Mike.
Okay, not very often. Once, I think.
Yeah, I was going to just add to what Nichelle said. Maybe this isn't exactly the point of getting people to say yes, but I think expectation management around that early first transition and change is really important, because they don't feel it immediately, the benefit. But if you can sort of manage that by telling them this is the way you're going to feel at first, and then they will, at least our experience is, they will realize the benefit when it comes around for amendments and AEs and, you know, continuing review and all that kind of stuff. It won't be that long before they realize it, but that first part, I think you have to manage.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a great question.
Really good question. What else do we have?
I don't have any submitted, so ask if anybody wants
I
Go
guess
ahead.
the
Keep
other
going.
side of that coin would be, what would be your selling points to the IRB you would like to rely on who is apprehensive about taking over that role of single IRB?
So you're asking about the other side of the coin, which is if you're working with institutions and the lead site or whatever is being asked to be the IRB and their IRB is apprehensive about it.
Mm-hmm. Or just you have those 15 sites and somebody needs to be the single IRB,
Right.
you know you want them to be, and no one's decided who's going to do that yet.
So here's my 2 cents on that is I would say if the IRB is apprehensive about doing it, they're right to be apprehensive. It is a lot of work, and I would be, whereas we have one thing with relying sites where we need to get sites to rely because that's the trend, that's the way things are going. NIH requires it, the common rule requires it now. I would be, no institution is required to step up to serve as a single IRB. And so I would be worried about being in a place where we're trying to convince somebody's IRB to take on that responsibility, because unless they have very carefully thought it out, I mean, I'll admit it, we went into single IRB work probably 10 years ago, having no clue what the hell we were getting into. And we have learned a lot from it. And if I would look back now, I would quite possibly caution my 10-year ago self from agreeing to do it. And so I would be worried about, trying to convince somebody to do it. Definitely not all studies are created equal. And so there are some studies that are probably better to venture into, to dip your toe in, if you're going to be an institution that's going to do that. But again, it's not something that an academic IRB can just dabble in. They either have to be in it or they're not. And so I don't know, Mike, what do you think about that? You've been it, and Nichelle, you used to do it too. So,
you have to look at, one of the roles of the HRPP and IRB is to support your research infrastructure. And if it's your PI who's leading this study, I think that really provides an incentive for you to be able to do this. However, like you said, you got to make sure you have the proper resources in order to be able to do it. And I think one thing we're seeing now is this transition to using the independent or commercial IRBs. And that is an option people should consider. It's costly, it's expensive, but to properly run an academic central IRB is also expensive. So, I think that the idea of using these commercial IRBs is becoming more receptive. There's a number of NIH networks. The Siren network now uses a commercial IRB as their central IRB. StrokeNet is going to use a central IRB for some studies moving forward. So, I think that the commercial IRBs are another option to consider when you're in that situation, especially for very large multi-site studies. I mean, you don't want to do it for a 2 or 3 site study probably, but for a large multi-site study, it is an option.
Well, I think what I might add, and I appreciate Jeremy's perspective, because that's why my institution, we agree to be reviewing IRB, but only for up to 15 sites, which is arbitrary, but we know what our limits are. And I do worry that some IRBs do not think through what their limits are and say yes, and then it's not good for anybody. But having said that, one thing that can help too is my institution, as just an example, we would consider going beyond the 15 sites if we knew we were working with a study team that really had its act together, had the great management team, and had the communication and the resources to be an effective lead study team, because you're really helping the IRB do the lifting in that case too. And so that's also another thing if there's an institution that thinks they might have the capacity, but they're not so sure, it's having that conversation like, this is what we have, and this is why this will be successful. I think that's really important, that we would have people come to us and ask us to be the reviewing IRB, and they'd want to enroll trainers for high school athletic trainers from all these different high schools in Iowa, and we're in Wisconsin. We're like, no, that's an independent IRB. We can't do that. We can't do that. But when they did it in Wisconsin, we knew the state law. We had everything, and they were managing well. That was a different story. So sometimes the circumstances of the study and the preparation of the study team and resources can make a difference too.
Okay, I think we got a virtual question.
Yeah, we got one by email. So here's the question. The discussion around single IRB was focused on institutional single IRBs of record where there is federal funding. For studies that involve sponsors that do not have federal funding, but they have had central IRB as the IRB of record, what is the institution's preference? And would it still be able to run the study through the local IRB versus a central IRB?
So I'm going to kind of unpack that a little bit, make sure you understand it. So the first question is, we have a multi-center study with non-federal funding. What is the perspective around using single IRB in that case? And what would the institution's preference be?
Would they still be able to run it through a local IRB instead of a central IRB if they wanted?
Run it. Okay. So I would say the answer to the third question, the third part of the question, is the easy one. And that answer would be yes. There's no regulatory mandate to use a single IRB in that case. It might be incredibly inefficient, but there's no mandate. For the first two questions, I don't know what others think. Nichelle or Mike, or I don't know about the prospect of using a central IRB for a non-federally funded study. And I guess I will also say, I'll just take a whim. I'll just take an audible on this, and I'll also say a non-industry funded study too. So we're talking in this case non-pharmaceutical company or non-device company, non-NIH funded, foundation funded study, or some other, or unfunded study. I don't know what you guys think about that.
So we've done a couple of those, and I think it goes back to kind of what I said before. If the PI is a UC faculty member and has asked us to do this, and we think we can. We've done that. We've done it for unfunded. We've done it with studies funded through foundations mostly, but we have done it before, and I think it again comes back to the role of the HRPP, within an institution, and we're here to support research. And so if it's possible, again, we got to make sure we'd be able to do it. The one we did was actually, it was a study by one of our oral surgeons, and it was done in dental practices. And this would be similar to Jeremy's comments. We probably should have thought about that one a little more before saying yes, because, these were all independent dental practices that really hadn't done research. And it was basically a minimal risk study. But yes, we've done those types of studies, and we're open to doing those as a central IRB.
You'll find institutions too that are pretty strict. They'll say, okay, it's not required by the regulations. We just won't enter into a Reliance arrangement. And I think that's changing. I hope that's changing, because the whole point of single IRB, and as we get better at that, it is more efficient. It can be more efficient. I mean, it does depend on the reviewing IRB. It depends on the study teams and the sites involved. But at its best, it can be a good arrangement regardless of the funding or the regulatory status of the research. And the one about the athletic trainers, it was helpful because a lot of institutions, like Mike said, we said, sure, we'll do that. And other institutions were so happy to cede review to IRB because they didn't want to touch that because of it involving kids. And these weren't usual institutions that did research, but you can meet that resistance. So in some ways, I still even think that sometimes it's worthwhile to do it, even if you can't get all sites to use a single IRB. If you can get a majority, it can still be helpful to streamline that way. But it depends on what the portfolio looks like. But it's worth exploring. But you may find that some institutions that say, if we don't have to do it, we're not going to do it. But I think as institutions get better at this and more comfortable, more of them will just do it regardless of the whether it's required or not.
And I'll just say, so at Cincinnati Children's, I will say the majority of our single IRB portfolio that we are doing single IRB work for is non-federally funded foundation, PCORI, other funding source type projects. So it definitely does happen. I think for all the reasons that Michelle and Mike said, it can be a good idea just because it is more efficient.
We
All
got
right,
more
next
research
question.
as a result of that. Like it opened up research opportunities because we were willing to serve as single IRB for other sites. So that's another bonus.
Definitely. Go ahead.
All right, so we got another question by email. So Nichelle talked about having the communication process planned out before applying for funding, et cetera. Is there a point person in place or templates that are available for teams developing their relying communications protocols at the beginning of this whole process?
Go, Nichelle. You guys have got great resources.
So
for Smart IRB.
Well, thank you for that too. So the current resources we do have, if you go to smartirb.org, there's a resources page there, and there's actually a learning center that has these resources for study teams too. So there is a communication plan template there that I'd highly recommend using to help guide you develop that. And then there are these presentations there that we have that are directed at study teams that talk about developing your single IRB plan and talks about the communication plan as well. The other thing that we don't have ready yet, but we're working on, and I'm working on with some study teams, and I'm want to get others involved, is actually a checklist for those who are serving as lead study teams about the kinds of things you would need to think about and have in place to be an effective lead study team. So watch out for that as well. Are there other things that you guys would want to mention, Mike or Jeremy or Pooja or James?
I would just say, just to make sure that folks that are listening are oriented, and I know this wasn't supposed to be about Smart IRB, but Smart IRB is great. And so I think for a lot of us, when we think of Smart IRB, we think of it was a project that got funded to put in place a national master IRB Reliance Agreement. And that was a huge lift, and that was a fantastic thing that they did. But the ongoing work of the Smart IRB collaborative, I don't know what the right word is to use for it, Nichelle, is looking at these different best practices and looking at ways to educate and looking at different resources that can be provided to move the whole mission forward of kind of single IRB review amongst academic institutions. And so the education and the material that's out there on their website is definitely something that people should not be shy to go access and look at and think about when they're submitting grant applications or organizing their multi-site project and thinking about how the single IRB part of that project is going to work. And so it's definitely not just the Master Reliance Agreement, although that's, I think, what people immediately think about when they think about Smart IRB. My plug is
yeah, not direct, maybe not directly responsive to the question, but I think one thing, and I'm not sure we raised, that investigators really need to think about is the cost.
Mm-hmm.
Single IRB review is not free. You know, if we're being the IRB of record for sites outside of the University of Cincinnati, there's going to be additional costs that are going to have to be covered, you know, by your grant, and the NIH allows that cost, but those costs can come off your bottom line from your funding too, depending on, you know, if it's an R01 or something like that. So considering the cost, talking to the local IRB, HRPP early in the process, so you understand what those costs are going to be. I think I saw Ben Kropp was on this study, and we're the central IRB for one of their NIH funded studies, and that, you know, it is a significant cost that's involved in running a central IRB. So remember that when you're heading down this path.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of our trainings is saying, remember to include budget, and also you may need a budget for personnel or for equipment or some things to be able to disseminate and share data. So there's, and I think this also gets to when you're writing your protocol, because now NIH requires you to write your protocol, putting in some key language there to really clue in NIH, like you're aware of the single IRB requirement, and you're aware that you need to have a point of contact to communicate between the institutions to address this single IRB. And there's some resources for that on the Smart IRB website, you can always contact me too. I know that Mina knows how to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to share my email and talk through if you need to, and refer you to appropriate folks too. So that's what we're here for, to help you guys. And I'd love to hear if there are resources you think that you need that we can focus our efforts on developing, because I think within the next year, the efforts will focus a lot on study team needs.
So in our last couple minutes here, I wanted to see, does anybody that is on the line, I know we've received a few questions by email, but does anybody that's on the call want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Who's brave? Anybody? Okay.
Call out at somebody there whose name you recognize, Jeremy.
No, nobody's brave. I won't call anybody out.
Jane Strasser does that on her webinar. Just calls you out.
But no.
Bueller.
Good question.
Hey,
Yeah,
Jeremy.
Bueller.
Debbie,
Yeah.
Debbie, yeah, there. I saw your mic come unmuted. Go ahead.
I was a little nervous, really, but I know we've gotten feedback from the IRBs, we've gotten feedback from PIs. Having been one of those IRB liaison persons myself, I think one thing that always surprises the PIs is when as we've done it, we've kind of established a little bit of a timeline, and it's always surprising to the PIs how long that actually takes. And it's really the initial process of just getting the sites first up and running and getting them approved. And we're finding that it takes on average about 4 to 6 months from the time we get our initial protocol approved. We start sending all the documents to the sites. They start working with their local IRBs, and Nichelle, your slide was great that showed all the pieces that the institutions look into. They sign things and get things back to us. They have to work on their site-specific consent language that we incorporate into the consent. So I don't know if other teams are finding the same thing. We've done several single IRB studies in our department. And like I said, usually there's a couple sites that can do it quicker than that, 4 to 6 months, but kind of 4 to 6 months seems to be average. And it always surprises our lead PI when we tell them that. I don't think they usually believe that. So I'm not sure how many PIs are on the call that maybe haven't done single IRB, but just kind of to be aware of that timeline.
No, I think that's a really good point, because I would say to folks that, you're right, not all sites are created equal. I would also say that, like with StrokeNet, where it's a very established network of sites that they may, over time, start getting studies started up quicker than the studies started up the first study that came through the network. But I guess the thing that I always tell PIs is that you're not going to get, and I think, James, you kind of said this well, in that it's not necessarily going to be any faster at initial approval, but you get that economy over the life of the study. When amendments start coming through, when continuing reviews are done, and that's where the economy of scale, I guess, comes, or the efficiency kind of comes, at least in my experience. It's not likely at startup. Again, unless you're with a very well-established network where everybody really kind of, it's old hat and everybody knows the ropes and they know how to work through everything. But if it's, study number one of a new consortium or a new collective of sites, I think 4 or 5 months is probably pretty right for what it takes. I don't know if you or if Pooja want to comment on that, but
I think I'd be interested in, Mike, your thoughts too, but I would say bottom line, yes, totally, it takes longer than we think. And we've set the expectation. We have a round of grant submissions going in right now, and we've set the expectation that you shouldn't expect to get your first patient in until 9 months after you got the grant award, just to give you a sense of the scale in terms of contracts and then central IRB.
Yeah, our experience has been exactly as Jeremy described, and I know Debbie and I have worked on a project too, and if the investigators aren't used to it, you can even gauge that 4 to 6 months probably a little bit by the type of project and the investigators involved and whether they've been through this before. Because if they have, then they understand and they know, and it's back to the expectation management. And if they haven't, then they're gonna grumble for a while, but they'll get through it and then they'll see the benefit.
I think Pooja knows this, that we still see some sites, not naming names, but local IRBs do a full review of these studies, even though they're relying on another IRB. And there's no regulatory authority to their review, but it goes to a board meeting, it gets reviewed, it gets discussed, and it's a waste of time. And
And that's something that I think we need to do better at in the IRB community, right? Because there's no regulation that says they can't either.
No,
So
right. No,
that's
there's nothing
unfortunate.
that says they can't.
Okay, well, I want to take a last minute here to thank Nichelle and Mike and Pooja and James for participating in this. Thank you to everybody for the questions. Thanks to the CCTST for helping us put this on.